Imagine that you're a migrant laborer from Bangladesh arriving in Qatar to do construction work. You're here because wages are much higher in Qatar than back home, and a Qatari employer has employed you and sponsored your work visa. Once you arrive, you're put to work for long hours in 100-plus-degree heat with no rest days while being subjected to physical and verbal abuse by your superiors. However, you are not legally allowed to change employers and have no legal recourse to improve your working conditions. If you leave your employer's home against their consent, you face jail time and quite possibly deportation. This story is a part of daily life for migrant laborers in the Arab world, especially in the GCC states. In the GCC states, migrant laborers comprise the majority of private sector workers. The oppressive system that these foreign workers live under is called the kafala system. The kafala system is a form of slavery that persists today. Off the backs of foreign labor, the Gulf states have built up their flashy world-class cities and infrastructure projects. In this video, we're going to look at the origins of the kafala system and its impact on the Arab Gulf states. What exactly is the kafala system? According to an article by the Council on Foreign Relations, the kafala system is a legal framework that has for decades defined the relationship between migrant workers and their employers in Jordan, Lebanon, and all Arab Gulf states but Iraq. It was created to supply cheap, plentiful labor in an era of booming economic growth. The article goes on to say, there is growing recognition that it is rife with exploitation. The lack of regulations and protections for migrant workers often results in low wages, poor working conditions, and employee abuse. Racial discrimination and gender-based violence are endemic. The modern kafala system has its origins in the early 20th century pearl industry, as the Persian Gulf was a major supplier of pearls. This system was intended to regulate the treatment of foreign pearl divers along with foreign workers in other trades. After World War II, the oil-rich Gulf states sought temporary migrant workers to work on large-scale infrastructure projects. These laborers were sponsored by a kafil, usually a local employer or a citizen, who on paper is supposed to protect them and ensure their well-being. The kafil covers the foreign workers' travel expenses and provides them with housing. In practice, this created a power imbalance between the workers and their kafils. Initially, workers came from other Arab countries like Egypt and Yemen. In more recent decades, migrant laborers from the Indian subcontinent, Africa, and Southeast Asia have made up a larger share of the expatriate workforce. After the 1991 Persian Gulf War, these expatriates began to outnumber their Arab counterparts. 2 million Yemenis, Palestinians, and Egyptians were expelled from the region, a consequence of their government's support for Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in August 1990. Rather than hiring workers directly, kafils use private recruitment agencies in the laborers' countries of origin. The kafala system is usually under the jurisdiction of interior ministries rather than the labor ministries of these countries. Thus, expatriate workers are not protected by these states' labor laws. They are also not permitted to join or form unions or enter into a labor dispute process, among other disadvantages. As a result of their tiny populations and even tinier native labor pools, the GCC states have relied heavily upon foreign labor. In every GCC member state, save for Saudi Arabia, expatriate workers comprise a demographic majority. Over the last 5 decades, the populations of the GCC states have swelled tenfold, and this is primarily driven by the influx of expatriates. However, these workers are not eligible for citizenship or the same legal rights as citizens of these countries. An inherent problem with the economies of the Gulf is the lack of enthusiasm among GCC citizens for private sector work. The 6 GCC states, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, Oman, Kuwait, and the UAE, are what are called rentier states. Rentier states are states that derive all or a substantial portion of their revenues from rents paid by other foreigners. This term is often used in reference to the Gulf Arab states. These countries' oil wealth precludes genuine domestic economic productivity and political reforms. The citizens of these states are lavished with government subsidies in the form of subsidized utilities, free college, direct welfare payments, and more, and enjoy a standard of living comparable to those of the US and Western Europe. GCC citizens are mostly employed in cushy, do-nothing public sector jobs, therefore they are disincentivized from participating in the private sector. Acquiescence on the citizens' part is rewarded with high living standards. In fact, it is precisely because of these generous benefits that these countries have extremely selective citizenship laws and why expatriate workers are not given citizenship. Defenders of the kafala system argue that it benefits local businesses in GCC states and encourages economic development. Its detractors point out that the kafala system is exploitative, and it is worth noting that the Middle East lags globally in legal protections for workers. Laws that do protect workers are often not enforced. In recent years, the kafala system has attracted negative attention precisely because of its exploitative nature. During the 2022 FIFA World Cup in Qatar, the horrors of the kafala system became more prominent in the public consciousness. The Qatari government relied on slave labor to prepare the country for the hosting of the World Cup. Qatari authorities say hundreds of expatriate workers died preparing for the World Cup, though human rights investigators estimate that thousands had perished. Interestingly enough, however, Qatar has introduced substantive reforms to the kafala system. Qatar became the first GCC state to allow migrant workers to change jobs without their employer's consent and established a higher minimum wage for all workers. Kuwait was the first Gulf state to set a minimum wage for migrant laborers. The Deputy Middle East Director at Human Rights Watch said, Qatar's new labor reforms are some of the most significant to date and could, if carried out effectively, considerably improve migrant workers' living and work conditions. In 2015, Qatar instituted a law on the entry, exit, and residency status of expatriate laborers. Over the following decade, amendments have been made to this law. One such amendment is the loosening of restrictions on employees changing employers. However, it must be stated that a major power imbalance still exists between Qatari employers and migrant workers. Employers are still responsible for their residency and work permits, and undocumented migrant workers still face stiff penalties. Employers can still confiscate the expatriates' passports and use deceptive recruiting practices to attract more laborers. Employees, meanwhile, are still not allowed to join or form unions. Expatriate laborers make up 90+% of Qatar's workforce. At the UN COP28 conference on climate change in Dubai in late 2023, abuses against migrant laborers returned to the public's attention. The sites holding the conference were linked to abuses against expatriate workers, including passport confiscation, wage theft, and discrimination. Employers had also forced their employees to work in the extreme summer heat, which is over 100+ degrees in the Gulf, in contravention of summer midday work bans that prohibit outdoor work from 12:30 p.m. to 3 p.m. Workers who are injured or become ill in the UAE are left to fend for themselves with no form of safety net. Extreme heat in particular exacerbates pre-existing conditions and increases the risk of workplace injuries. To make matters worse, these migrant laborers are not given access to cold water or shaded rest areas. The UAE has likewise introduced reforms to their labor laws, though these reforms leave much to be desired. The previously mentioned Deputy Middle East Director at Human Rights Watch said in reference to Saudi Arabia has one of the most abusive versions of the kafala system in the region, and the reforms are limited, problematic, and by no means dismantle the kafala system. Over the last few years, Saudi Arabia has made half-hearted attempts at labor reform. In 2000, the term kafala was removed from its laws, although the system still existed in practice. In 2015, Saudi Arabia put regulations in place that raised fines on employers who violate labor laws. The 2015 reforms did not protect domestic workers, and many workers were actually excluded from the law's protections. Employees were also given permission to leave their jobs without their employer's consent, though employers still retained a significant degree of de facto control over their employees. Reforms to the kafala system in other GCC states have been more impactful than in Saudi Arabia. The kafala system is a form of slavery which still persists in Arab countries, especially the rich petrostates of the Gulf Cooperation Council. This brutal and exploitative system has promoted the economic growth and development of the countries practicing it on the backs of 21st century slaves. In the Gulf states especially, masses of laborers from other Arab countries, South Asia, and Africa build up the infrastructure of these states for the benefit of their minuscule citizen populations. Despite the reforms that have been made, employers in these countries are little more than glorified 21st century slave owners. What do you guys think? What can be done to do away with the kafala system? How can the GCC states increase indigenous participation in their respective private sectors? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.